The man known to history as Ulysses S. Grant was born as Hiram Ulysses Grant on the 27th of April 1822 in Point Pleasant, a small rural community in the southwest of the relatively young state of Ohio. His father was Jesse Root Grant, a farmer, tanner, and leather merchant who hailed originally from Pennsylvania and who could trace his ancestry in America back to the first establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Jesse had moved westwards along with so many Americans in the early 19th century in search of new opportunities as the United States expanded from the east coast of North America. Ulysses' mother was Hannah Grant, originally Hannah Simpson. Her ancestry lay amongst the Presbyterian Scots, who had moved from Scotland to Ulster in the north of Ireland during the 17th century, and then emigrated again in great numbers from Ireland to North America in the course of the 18th century. She had married Jesse Grant in 1821, and Ulysses was their first child. She was a deeply religious woman, and Ulysses is believed to have taken after his mother more than his father, although he might well have acquired his anti-slavery stance from Jesse, who was a proclaimed abolitionist, meaning that he wished for slavery to be brought to an end throughout the United States. Ulysses would grow up in a large household, as he had 5 siblings: Simpson, Clara, Orville, Jenny, and Mary. The family was well enough off that Ulysses was provided with a substantial education at numerous private schools. This included a stint at the Rankin Academy in 1838. This was run by John Rankin, a noted abolitionist and educator who was prominent in running the Underground Railroad at the time. This was a system of safe houses and transport networks which abolitionists in America used to help escape slaves in the southern states of America to flee from slavery. Grant was growing up at a time when the United States was expanding swiftly, having largely been confined to a series of states along the eastern seaboard of North America in the 18th century. American eyes were turning west from 1800 onwards, with expansion towards the Great Lakes in the north and westwards towards the Mississippi River and the border with Spain's colonial possessions in Texas, New Mexico, and California. Beyond this territorial expansion, the social fabric of the country was shifting dramatically. Under British rule, slavery had been practiced throughout the colonies, though it was engaged in to a much greater extent in the southern colonies of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, with their sprawling cotton and tobacco plantations. Change was on the way though, as by 1800 a number of northern states, including New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, inspired by the abolitionist movement, had banned slavery. By the time of Grant's birth, others, such as New Jersey, had become free states, while the period of his youth and adolescence saw the states directly to the west, such as Illinois and Michigan, follow their more liberal neighbors to the east. But the southern states remained unswerving in their defense of the institution of slavery, and so the stage was already being set during Grant's youth for a titanic struggle between the northern and southern states. Ultimately, Ulysses would find himself foisted into the conflicts of American society in the mid-19th century, owing to a decision made by his father in 1839. At this time, when Ulysses was still just 17, his father requested an acquaintance to nominate his son to the United States Military Academy at West Point in the state of New York, then, as now, the leading military academy in the United States. The application was successful, though, owing to an error in his registration, Hiram Ulysses Grant was recorded as Cadet Ulysses S. Grant on entry. This new name stuck. Grant was initially skeptical about life at West Point, but he eventually grew into it, acquiring a reputation while there for his equestrian skills. Though, more broadly, he was only an average pupil. When he graduated in June 1843, he did so ranked 21st of 39 cadets in his class. Having finished at West Point, he was quickly appointed to the 4th Infantry Division and sent to St. Louis in the state of Missouri as a brevet second lieutenant. Grant seems to have been relatively uncommitted to a military career at this point and considered this a temporary posting, from which he might retire in a year or two. Yet it was a highly significant period in other ways. While at West Point, Grant had befriended Frederick Tracy Dent, a fellow cadet who was slightly older than Ulysses. Dent originally hailed from Whitehaven near St. Louis, and Grant became a regular visitor at the Dent household following his arrival in Missouri. He had soon struck up a relationship with Dent's sister, Julia, and in 1844 they were engaged. The union, though, would not be formalized into a marriage for another 4 years, as war on the southern border interrupted their plans in this regard. The war, which erupted in 1846, was the direct result of the contentious position of Texas between the United States and Mexico, traditionally part of Spain's colonial possessions in Central America. Texas had become part of Mexico when the country acquired independence from its mother country, Spain, in the early 1820s. However, Texas's position within the broader Mexican state was always contentious, and in 1836 it broke away into a new Republic of Texas. Thereafter, it gravitated towards the US, and when he was elected as president late in 1844, a major plank of James Polk's policy platform was expansion of the United States into Texas. This was duly accomplished in 1845 with the formal annexation of the Republic of Texas. However, Mexico was unwilling to accept this new dispensation. In particular, a boundary dispute arose over where the new border between the US and Mexico should lie, Polk's administration favoring the Rio Grande, and the Mexican government arguing that the frontier should be located along the more northerly Nueces River. These issues spilled over into war in 1846. Grant's role in the war was limited as a junior officer, but also formative in its own way, as he fought at the Battle of Palo Alto, the first major clash of the war, near Brownsville in Texas on the 8th of May 1846. It was also the first time Grant had seen active combat. He subsequently served as a regimental quartermaster further west towards California and then in Mexico itself in 1847. He earned a commendation for his role in the Battle of Molino del Rey, fought near Mexico City in September 1847. And so, while he did not have any major command during the US-Mexican War, it is increasingly viewed as an important period in his career as a military commander. It was between 1846 and 1848 that Grant gained his first experience of warfare, and it was to be the only war he fought in prior to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, and as such, it must be considered his most active training period for the later conflict. Ultimately, the US-Mexican War ended in a total US victory. Having secured the border regions in the opening months of the conflict, General Winfield Scott advanced into Mexico itself in the spring of 1847, eventually occupying Mexico City, a campaign which Grant was involved in. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, agreed in February 1848, saw Mexico acknowledge US control over Texas, while the Rio Grande was established as the border between the two nations. Consequently, while the US did not take the opportunity provided by its complete military victory to acquire further land from Mexico, the peace essentially consolidated its position in Texas and established the modern border between the two countries. In the aftermath of the US-Mexican War, Grant returned to St. Louis and married Julia Dent. Theirs was a close relationship, though initially it caused a rupture between Grant and his parents, who were discontented with the Dents being slave owners. Despite their family squabbling, which continued with varying degrees of intensity for decades to come, there is little doubting Ulysses and Julia's affection for one another. She had a cast in her left eye and squinted as a result of it, a characteristic which years later, when Ulysses became president, she considered having surgery to correct. He vetoed the idea, stating that he loved her just as she was. Evidently, it was Julia's liveliness and other character traits which made Ulysses devoted to her. Eventually, they would have 4 children, 3 boys, Frederick, Ulysses Jr., and Jesse, and a girl named Ellen. But Ulysses and Julia's early family life was repeatedly interrupted by Grant's military postings. In the years following the US-Mexican War, he was moved around several times to different military commands in Detroit and New York State, but it was finally to California that he was dispatched in the early 1850s. Gold had been discovered out on the west coast, and as settlement increased there around the middle of the century, a heightened military presence was needed. Julia was heavily pregnant at the time, and Grant was forced to leave her in the east, while he headed west. The next few years were a bleak period. Grant was moved around repeatedly across California and the Oregon Territory. In an effort to better support his young family back home, he entered into several business ventures on the side, each of which failed. Then he started drinking more heavily, the beginnings of a long acquaintance he would have with the bottle. And eventually it was repeated acts of drunkenness and the clashes these caused with his commanding officers which led him to resign from the military on the 31st of September 1854. Thus, at 32 years of age, and with no idea of what he might do henceforth, Grant headed back east to St. Louis to be reunited with his wife and family. Life outside the military, though, did not bring any relief from his hardships, as back in St. Louis, things went from bad to worse. Having accepted a farm allotment from Julia's father, he nevertheless continued to struggle financially, in part owing to an economic recession in the US in 1857. A venture into real estate proved abortive, and in the late 1850s, Grant was reduced to selling firewood on a St. Louis street corner to make some extra cash, and even pawned a gold watch, a prized possession, at one point. Years later, F. Scott Fitzgerald would state that there are no second acts in American life. He should perhaps have considered the highly successful second act of Ulysses S. Grant before making this assertion. In the early 1860s, Grant's life was to take a striking turn, brought about almost entirely by the crisis which enveloped America in the aftermath of the election of Abraham Lincoln as the 16th President of the United States in the presidential election of November 1860. Tensions had been brewing for decades between the free states in the north of the United States and the slave-owning states of the South. Now in 1860, Lincoln, though willing to compromise with the slave-owning states, was built into a bogeyman by the southern states, one who would seek to end slavery altogether in America. As a result, upon his election, the state of South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. It was soon joined by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas in that decision, and these 7 breakaway southern states formed themselves into a confederacy. Outright armed hostilities between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy commenced in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked a Union-held garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, following which several more southern states seceded and joined the Confederacy, the capital of which was eventually established at Richmond in Virginia. The American Civil War had begun. Upon the outbreak of hostilities in the spring of 1861, Grant rejoined the army after a near 7-year absence. In the initial stages of the conflict, he was involved in efforts to recruit and train forces in Missouri and Illinois, but it was not long before he had been given a command in southern Illinois, based on his previous military experience. He would spend the first year of the war operating in the border region between southern Illinois and Kentucky, and further south towards Tennessee, playing a delicate balancing act in areas where military heavy-handedness was frowned upon in the hopes that these communities straddling the North and the South could be won over to the Union cause. At the beginning of 1862, frustrated by his lack of major commands, Grant sought and received permission from General Henry Halleck to undertake an offensive campaign. Campaigning south with 25,000 men, he won one of the first major victories of the war for the Union when he besieged and captured Fort Donelson on the River Cumberland in Tennessee. About 15,000 Confederate troops in total were captured in the engagement. Moreover, Grant had proved his daring and activist approach. When the commander of Fort Donelson had inquired as to what terms of surrender might be offered, Grant had replied that the only terms he was prepared to offer were unconditional surrender, as he intended to move presently against the fort. As a result of his actions at Fort Donelson, Grant was now promoted to the rank of Major General. 2 months later, he was the major Union commander at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee on the 6th of April 1862, where over 100,000 Union and Confederate troops fought. Grant was theoretically victorious and repelled the Confederate incursion into the region, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, which resulted in over 10,000 Union troops being either killed or wounded. Grant's reputation, which had soared following the seizure of Fort Donelson, was now damaged. This was probably not aided by reports of his drinking. While we can probably dismiss legendary tales about Grant keeping a barrel of whiskey outside his tent while on campaign during the Civil War, there seems to be much truth to allegations that he was a heavy binge drinker on occasion, although one who often abstained for considerable periods of time. The most likely scenario suggests that Grant was prone to bouts of heavy drinking, but rarely drank heavily when he knew some important task lay ahead of him. Despite these setbacks, before the end of 1862, Grant had convinced his superiors to allow him to proceed towards Mississippi, where he planned to seize Vicksburg, one of the Confederates' major strongholds on the Mississippi River. This he duly succeeded in accomplishing 6 months later, when it finally surrendered on the 4th of July 1863. Grant's actions here were particularly notable, as the Vicksburg campaign ensured Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in two, between those states further to the west and the core of the southern states to the east of the Mississippi. While Grant was making a major name for himself in Tennessee and Mississippi, the war was proceeding with mixed results for both sides. While 1861 had seen the outbreak of the war and the consolidation of the Confederacy, in 1862 it settled into a particularly intense campaign in the eastern states around Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, where the Union and Confederacy were in the peculiar position of having their respective capitals less than 100 miles away from each other. But it was in 1863 that the war really turned. It was this year that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, making the abolition of slavery in the Confederate States a stated war goal for the Union. Henceforth, it was clear that victory for the Union in the war would mean an end to the institution of slavery throughout the United States. Having won a significant victory repelling the Union forces at Chancellorsville in Virginia, the leading Confederate general Robert E. Lee undertook a campaign into the north through Pennsylvania in the early summer of 1863. This culminated in the 3-day-long Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania between the 1st and 3rd of July, the bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War. Gettysburg saw Lee's Army of Northern Virginia heavily defeated, with nearly 25,000 of his 75,000-man army either killed or wounded. It was a turning point in the entire conflict, which combined with Grant's seizure of Vicksburg to the west a day later on the 4th of July, put the Union on the offensive. It has also gone down in history as much for Lincoln's address to mark the battle the following November, in which he spoke of the great Civil War being fought to ensure that freedom shall not perish from the earth. Meanwhile, in recognition of his prowess in the field and accomplishments in the seizure of Vicksburg and other strategic sites, Grant was appointed as Lieutenant General in March 1864 and placed in overall command of the Union Army. He was now in charge of the effort to finally defeat the Confederacy and bring the war to an end. Grant's strategy was relatively simple in 1864. He intended to use the Union's numerical superiority to essentially confine Robert E. Lee's forces, protecting Richmond within the state of Virginia, while several of his sub-commanders would conduct campaigns further to the south and southwest, for instance, seizing Georgia. This strategy was broadly successful elsewhere, although despite the tightening of the noose on Richmond, Grant failed to take the Confederate capital in 1864, even after a near 2-week-long bloody engagement at Cold Harbor some 10 miles from the city ended in a stalemate. Grant's forces now settled in June 1864 into what would become a 9-month siege of the town of Petersburg, not far from Richmond, As it wore on, though, the siege of Petersburg became symptomatic of the Confederate cause in general. The breakaway affiliation was now largely confined to isolated centers of control out further west in Alabama and Texas, and a strip of land running along the east coast around Virginia and parts of the Carolinas and Georgia. By the autumn of 1864, the city of Atlanta in Georgia had been captured, and the Union Army had advanced as far as the Atlantic coast in parts of the South. As the winter set in, Lee's troops in Virginia began to desert in large numbers, owing to starvation and the general hopelessness of the Confederate cause. And by the spring of 1865, Lee's position was hopeless. The American Civil War eventually came to an end on the 9th of April 1865. A week earlier, Lee had abandoned the line which he had been trying to hold around Petersburg. Richmond was now open to a Union advance. As a result, on the 9th of April, Lee agreed to meet with Grant in the courthouse in the village of Appomattox in Virginia to negotiate the surrender of the Confederacy. Here, the two generals reminisced about their experiences in the war with Mexico nearly 20 years earlier, before getting round to the business of ending the Civil War. Grant, for his part, was authorized to negotiate that there would be few reprisals of any kind for those who laid down their weapons. As a result, when word spread west to the Confederate forces in those states, the surrender was quickly agreed to, and the last fighting occurred in Texas at the end of May. Yet the man who had been at the center of these events would never live to see the ultimate cessation of hostilities. On the 14th of April, just 5 days after Lee had surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a stage actor and Confederate sympathizer, in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Grant himself had nearly been present with Lincoln, having turned down an offer to attend the performance with the president. Indeed, allegations flew in the days that followed that Grant was also a target of Booth and his co-conspirators. They were unsuccessful if he was. Grant lived, and Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, was sworn in as the great man's successor. The end of the war witnessed the inception of the policy of Reconstruction. On the surface, this was aimed primarily at bringing slavery to an end in the Confederate States and ending the remnants of secession in the South. But such was the manner in which slavery was ingrained into every aspect of the economy and society of the Southern states that Reconstruction would also necessarily require a massive program of social and economic reform if the Southern states were to evolve to become more like their more liberal Union neighbors to the North. Reconstruction would dominate U.S. politics during the immediate aftermath of the war, and primarily throughout Grant's presidency from 1869 to 1877. Even prior to his tenure in the White House, Grant was involved in Reconstruction politics. In the months after the conclusion of the Civil War, he was sent on a tour of the Southern states at the behest of President Johnson. This was important for two reasons. Grant was received favorably during his travels throughout the former Confederate states, somewhat surprisingly given his position as the Union's foremost general. This indicated that he could be a unifying figure during the Reconstruction period. Secondly, Grant submitted a report to Johnson upon completion of his tour, in which he recommended a lenient approach towards the former Confederate states he had just visited, in order to help end the bitterness of the Civil War. His drift towards politics did not end there. In 1866, he was appointed a general of the Federal Army, now that the Union titles of recent years were dispensed with. And then, in 1867, when Johnson removed Edwin M. Stanton from his position as Secretary of War, Grant was offered the position. Grant accepted the office on an interim basis in August 1867. However, a constitutional problem now arose surrounding the Tenure of Office Act. This dictated that a sitting cabinet secretary could only be removed by the executive with the consent of the Senate. As such, Johnson needed Stanton's removal to be sanctioned by the upper house of Congress. When the Senate refused to approve Stanton's dismissal in December 1867, Grant resigned in January, provoking a split with Johnson in the process, who had believed that Grant would refuse to relinquish his position as Secretary of War. This resulted in the decision over Stanton being sent to the courts for adjudication, Johnson's desired outcome. The major outcome of the split from Johnson and Grant's brief flirtation with the office of Secretary of War was that he was now viewed as a potential presidential candidate within the Republican Party. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago in mid-May 1868, Grant won the party's support. He would run against the Democrat Horatio Seymour, a former governor of the state of New York. The Civil War hero ran in the months that followed on a campaign slogan of "Let us have peace." Ultimately, the election race was much closer than many observers had expected. Overall, Grant won by just 300,000 votes in the popular vote, although the Electoral College result was much more comprehensive, Grant securing 214 votes compared to just 80 for Seymour. As a result, on the 4th of March 1869, Ulysses S. Grant was sworn into office as the 18th President of the United States. He would serve for 8 years, winning a second term in 1872, with a much more comprehensive victory over a divided opposition.
If you're a curious person, you might be concerned about what's happening in the media. You click on an article about a political figure you dislike doing something bad. Soon, your screen is filled with more articles about how terrible this person is. We're all fighting feedback loops designed to show us views we already agree with. Thankfully, there's a new website and app called Ground News that lets you compare how a single story is being covered across the political spectrum. Ground News doesn't use your browsing history to manipulate your news feeds. In fact, they go out of their way to show you information you might be missing by highlighting underreported stories on both the left and the right. Make sure you know what's really going on. Check out Ground News by visiting ground.news/people profiles to download the free app now.
During the 8 years in which he served as President of the United States, Grant would have to grapple with a large number of very grave challenges. None was more pressing than the issue of Reconstruction and the reunifying of the country after the trauma of a 4-year civil war. 2 weeks after entering office, he signed laws guaranteeing African Americans equal rights. Then, in the months that followed, his administration pressured those former Confederate states which had not ratified the 15th Amendment into doing so. This would guarantee Black Americans the right to vote in elections. The trade-off for the Southern states in accepting this would be readmittance to the Union once it had been ratified by each state legislature. As a result of this carrot-and-stick approach, by 1871, the recalcitrant states, including Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas, had complied and were readmitted to the Union. But in other respects, Reconstruction under Grant proved more difficult. Armed bands of traditional Southern conservatives sprung up across the former Confederate states in the late 1860s and early 1870s. The Ku Klux Klan was just the most prominent of these, and others, such as the Red Shirts and White League, collectively termed Redeemers, strove to use violence and intimidation to reclaim control of the southern states of the Democratic Party and force through a white supremacist agenda. In response, Grant's administration created the U.S. Justice Department and charged it with cracking down on white Redeemer movements in the South. In tandem, the Federal Army was dispatched to key sites in order to maintain law and order and defend Reconstruction. The result, it is generally acknowledged, is that Grant's administration crushed the power of the Ku Klux Klan for a generation in the South by arresting hundreds of senior members and prosecuting many of its most powerful benefactors who financed the Klan. Nevertheless, despite these efforts, it was clear by the mid-1870s that Reconstruction was largely failing, and Redeemer Democrats were seeking to create a society in the South, which, in the absence of slavery, would still disenfranchise and savagely oppress the large African American population across the former Confederate states. Reconstruction was intimately tied to the finances of the country. During the war, the Union government had resorted to issuing banknotes that were not backed up by the gold or silver standard. In the 19th century, all Western governments only issued money that was backed by a certain amount of gold and silver bullion reserves. The emergency caused by the Civil War had seen Lincoln's administration resorting to simply printing banknotes, resulting in considerable inflation. To correct the situation, Grant passed the Public Credit Act within 3 weeks of entering office. This essentially promised those who held banknotes issued during the Civil War that they would be repaid in coin backed by the gold and silver standard. The idea here was to curb inflation and also introduce much greater confidence into the financial system that the Civil War banknotes, termed greenback notes, were as good as real money and would not become worthless now that the war was receding in the collective memory. The overall effect of this was a continuation of the economic recovery, which had already started under Johnson's administration between 1865 and 1869. Yet it was not all smooth sailing on the financial front across the 8 years of Grant's administration. In 1873, an economic crisis developed following the collapse of the New York brokerage firm J. Cook & Company, which was heavily involved in the railway building boom of the time. As the west and east coasts were connected via extensive train lines, this was compounded by frailties in the global economic system, with Germany having demonetized silver in the aftermath of the unification of the country in 1871, triggering a series of financial failures in European capitals such as Vienna. The resulting downturn led to an economic depression, which would linger for the remainder of Grant's second term, creating financial hardship for many American citizens. The economic crisis was known at the time as the Great Depression, but this term was abandoned 70 years later when a much deeper economic crisis led to the period after the Wall Street crash of 1929 becoming known as the Great Depression. Accordingly, the economic crash and depression of 1873 to 1877 is today termed the Panic of 1873. On the foreign stage, Grant's policies were calm and pacifist. Despite his military background, he was no warmonger and deliberately tried to avoid conflict. However, he was also thoroughly inexperienced as a diplomat and left his foreign policy largely in the hands of the Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish. A number of issues confronted the US in the late 1860s. Firstly, the matter of reparations, and an apology from the British government for its supplying of naval support to the Confederacy during the Civil War remained unresolved. Several years of negotiations eventually resulted in the Treaty of Washington in 1871, whereby Britain acknowledged its role in building ships for the Confederacy and agreed to pay over $15 million in reparations. Thereafter, US-British relations improved steadily, and the two countries have been allies ever since. Just as pressing was the US's policy in the Caribbean, where a war, the 10 Years' War, had broken out between Cuban rebels and Spain in 1868. Despite occurring on its front door, the US maintained a policy of fairly strict neutrality in this, the first of 3 independence wars waged on the island of Cuba in the second half of the 19th century. More interventionist was the approach of the Grant administration to the island of Hispaniola. Then, as now, this was divided into 2 countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, or Santo Domingo. Grant was of the view that by acquiring control over Santo Domingo, the US could gain a strategic interest in the Caribbean and also in the lucrative sugar trade of the region. In 1869, negotiations were opened with the government there to purchase the country, with US business interests acting as intermediaries. But after 18 months of wrangling over this, the scheme came to nothing, largely owing to the opposition from within Congress. The affair tarnished Grant's reputation to some extent, and is an indication of the creeping imperialist aspirations of the US in advance of the most aggressive period of American empire in the 1890s. Grant's approach towards the Native American people was enlightened by 19th century standards. He was a relatively benign assimilationist, believing that the Native American people should be treated fairly and enjoined to embrace the benefits of a Western education, economy, culture, and government. This might seem like a heavy-handed form of cultural intolerance by today's standards, but for a country which counted several presidencies in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, whose policies towards the Native American people had bordered on genocidal, Grant's approach was comparatively progressive. As a result, several peace treaties were negotiated with the Apache and Sioux ends of the Plains and Midwest during his first term in office, and conflict between the Native American people and the federal government was at an historic low. However, Grant's Native American policy could ultimately not escape the historical circumstances in which it was conceived. Try as he might to forge a new pathway, decades of conflict, oppression, and broken promises had created a thick air of animosity towards the US government amongst the Plains Indians. This was compounded in 1874 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. As prospectors streamed into the region, the Sioux Indians there, led by Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull, prepared for conflict. The Great Sioux War of 1876 and 1877 was a bitter end to Grant's presidency. Though famed for the victory, Sitting Bull's Lakota Sioux Indians won over General George A. Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in late June 1876. The war ultimately ended in victory for the federal government. The administration of Rutherford B. Hayes, who had succeeded Grant by the time the war ended, imposed a harsh peace settlement whereby the lands of the Sioux were annexed and the Plains Indians of the region were forced into Indian reservations, a depressing end to Grant's enlightened Indian policy. In many other ways, Grant was ahead of his time. For instance, in 1875, he proposed a constitutional amendment to fundamentally weaken the ability of religious groups and churches to dominate the educational curriculum in a given state or region. Essentially, here he was calling for greater separation of church and state in a manner which was only beginning to be countenanced in the more liberal European countries. Equally, he was progressive in his advocacy for America's Jews, appointing dozens of Jewish Americans to federal office. Perhaps most unusual was his appointment of Eli S. Parker, a Seneca Indian, as his Commissioner for Indian Affairs. Yet Grant's presidency was not without scandal either. During the 1872 election campaign, the press revealed that a number of prominent members of the Republican Party had been involved in siphoning profits from the Union Pacific Railroad Company through a shady corporate entity called Crédit Mobilier. Grant, who it must be said was scrupulously honest throughout his military and political career, was not implicated directly, but the fallout, nevertheless, damaged the Republicans, and by implication, his presidency. Worse followed in 1875 with the so-called whiskey ring scandal. This had involved prominent federal officials and whiskey distillers defrauding the government out of tax revenues, facilitated by a widespread system of bribery. Again, Grant was not involved, but his private secretary, Orville E. Babcock, was, as was the Secretary of War, William Belknap. Resignations followed, but Grant again was damaged in the final 2 years of his presidency by the actions of others. The final act of Grant's presidency became one of the most controversial moments in the constitutional and electoral history of the United States, though Grant acquitted himself well throughout the course of it. With Grant having served 2 terms, the Republican Party had selected Rutherford B. Hayes to contest the 1876 presidential election against the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden. The election was held on the 7th of November 1876. The result, when it came, was highly contentious. In the mid-1870s, there were 369 electoral college votes. When the votes were counted, it was clear that Tilden had won 184 votes, one short of the 185 needed to be elected president. Hayes had certainly won 165 votes, but 20 votes were the subject of considerable dispute. These were the electoral college votes for the states of Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. In the case of Oregon, the vote was contested as one of the electors for the state was found to be illegitimate, as he was an appointed official there, while in the other 3 states the vote was close enough that both parties claimed victory. The dispute dragged on into 1877. As it did, Grant, as the sitting president, came center stage. He instructed Congress to resolve the matter through legislative action and according to the electoral rules. he also refrained from mobilizing the army in the event of continuing disagreement, and on the 29th of January 1877, he formed an electoral commission to decide on the matter. This eventually resulted in what was to become known as the Compromise of 1877. Under its terms, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected as the 19th President of the United States, a decision which was certainly fair, as the surviving evidence indicates that Hayes had actually won the 4 states in contention, though by less than 1,000 votes in the cases of both Florida and South Carolina. As such, Hayes would enter the White House with the smallest winning margin in the U.S. electoral history, winning the Electoral College vote by 185 votes to Tilden's 184 votes. But his victory came at a cost. In return for their acceptance of the result, the Democrats demanded that federal troops, which had been stationed across the former Confederacy states in the South since the end of the Civil War, should be removed from states such as Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. In the aftermath of their departure, the Democrats tightened their grip on the southern states, essentially rejecting Reconstruction and opting for a harsh imposition of Jim Crow laws, which disenfranchised the free African American community in the South of the United States. Part of Grant's legacy has been tied up in his role in the Compromise of 1877 and the manner in which it allowed for the oppression of the African American communities of the southern states for decades to come. Yet Grant can hardly be held accountable for this. The southern states always seemed likely to set out on the path which they did in 1877, and Grant can hardly have prevented this in his final days in office. Conversely, at the time, he was widely praised for the manner in which he averted a constitutional crisis and renewed violence across the United States through his handling of the election crisis. Once the compromise was reached, and Hayes eventually took up office in early March 1877, Grant was once again a private citizen. He was still just 54 years of age, a markedly young age for a man who had served an 8-year term and who had already lived such an eventful life up to that point. Given this, his later years might seem like something of an anticlimax, but they were not without their own considerable points of interest. First up was a world tour which he and Julia undertook. Over a 2.5-year period between the early summer of 1877 and the autumn of 1879, Europe was first on the itinerary, with the Grants travelling to England to meet with Queen Victoria before a long sojourn through continental Europe, in which audiences were had with Pope Leo XIII and the Chancellor of the newly established German Empire, Otto von Bismarck. Others whom they met with included Napoleon III of France and the celebrated German composer Richard Wagner. Further travel was then undertaken to the Holy Land and Egypt before returning to Europe and then heading onwards to Asia in 1879. The last leg of the world tour was the most interesting in many respects. While visiting Meiji, Japan, Grant became involved in efforts to establish a lasting peace between Japan and Qing China, during the course of which he got caught up in a conspiracy which aimed to assassinate both the Emperor Meiji and Grant himself. The Grants finally returned to the US, arriving in San Francisco in September 1879. During their long circumnavigation of the globe, Grant had received petitions from members of the Republican Party asking him to run again for the presidential office. In the 19th century, and for much of the 20th century, until the passage of the 22nd Amendment to the US Constitution by Congress in 1947, there was no legal barrier to serving more than 2 terms in office. However, tradition dictated that no one typically should serve more than 2 terms, in line with a precedent which George Washington had established. Now, however, many believed that tradition should be ignored to bring Grant back for a 3rd term. Grant was not indisposed to the scheme, and so encouraged his supporters to put forward his name at the Republican National Convention, which met at Chicago in early June 1880. What followed was a chaotic convention. 3 main candidates, Grant, James Blaine, and John Sherman, were the candidates. Grant secured the most votes in the initial voting. but not enough to reach the 370 votes required for any candidate to be officially selected by the party. After dozens of subsequent votes, the impasse was finally broken when Blaine's supporters conceived of a scheme to nominate a compromise candidate in the shape of James Garfield, like Grant, a former Union general who had fought in the Civil War. Realizing he was beaten, Grant eventually threw his backing behind Garfield. The Republicans finally had a candidate, one who won the subsequent presidential election, but he did not last long in office, as Garfield was assassinated in September 1881, just months after his inauguration, becoming the second of 4 US presidents to have been killed in office. His vice president, Chester A. Arthur, succeeded Garfield and served until 1885. In the aftermath of his world tour and his failed presidential bid, Grant returned to the world of business. This was a time when US presidents did not receive a pension after leaving office, and Grant had never been an affluent man, nor had he ever been an astute businessman, and his post-presidential ventures proved no exception to this rule. Incredibly, the Grants had actually lost money on their world tour, where Grant could have capitalized on his renown to profit from it, and a venture into the railway sector in the early 1880s also proved unfruitful. Then, in 1883, Grant became involved in a Wall Street business venture which his son Buck had undertaken with Ferdinand Ward, a financier and a conman. In New York City, Ward was soon engaging in highly fraudulent activity involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in what was effectively a pyramid scheme. As a silent partner, Grant was almost certainly oblivious to what was happening, but Buck Grant was quite possibly privy to Ward's actions. In any event, Grant himself testified against Ward in court in 1885, shortly before his own death. And when the full details emerged, it actually elicited public sympathy for Grant, who had been swindled considerably by Ward. While all of this was unfolding in New York, the former president was working away at what became the only truly profitable business venture of his entire life. A renowned storyteller, Grant decided in the early 1880s to write his memoirs. His financial situation was inestimably aided by an offer by Mark Twain to publish the memoirs and guarantee Grant 70% of the royalties, an enormous percentage which was a clear act of charity on Twain's part. Eventually finished in the early summer of 1885, the memoirs have been well regarded ever since, with Grant depicting himself fairly and accurately by most standards. They became a bestseller, and Julia Grant was able to live a comfortable later life from the proceeds of royalties, which nearly reached $500,000 in sales, a huge sum for the late 19th century. Yet Grant would never live to see his memoirs published. In the summer of 1884, he had developed a throat problem, which was subsequently diagnosed in October as throat cancer. It advanced rapidly, and Grant would ultimately die from it on the 23rd of July, 1885, just days after finishing his memoirs, and at the relatively young age of 63. Over 1.5 million people attended Grant's funeral in a long 11-kilometer procession through New York City on the 8th of August 1885. In sharp contrast to later impressions of his presidency, Grant was eulogized at the time as being comparable to George Washington. He was buried in Riverside Park, but his body was later re-entombed at the purpose-built General Grant National Memorial in the Morningside Heights neighborhood of Upper Manhattan, where it remains the largest burial tomb dedicated to an individual in the entirety of North America. During the 20th century, Ulysses S. Grant suffered from a poor reputation as one of the worst presidents of the United States, a belief repeatedly reaffirmed in polls and surveys. Views on him have changed to some extent in the last 20 years, but even so, this slightly more positive view of the 18th president has only seen him jump up the rankings to be considered about the 25th best or so of the 46 US presidents. Yet what the foregoing has sought to highlight is that this historical impression is largely unfair. To be sure, Grant had his flaws, but both as a military commander and as US president after the American Civil War, he accomplished much during a very tumultuous and difficult period in the history of the United States. Grant's military record speaks for itself to a large extent. Early on, he gained some attention for his service during the US-Mexican War, but thereafter, owing to a number of personal motives, he drifted away from military service. The outbreak of the American Civil War, though, in 1861, brought him back into the field. In the early years of that conflict, he distinguished himself well enough to become one of the Union's senior commanders, and no one was as prominent as him in the final reduction of the Confederacy in 1864 and 1865. Many scholars have pointed to the overwhelmingly superior resources which Grant had at his disposal against Robert E. Lee in these closing stages of the war, and suggest that he could not really lose given these advantages. But several other Union generals had previously been given the same resources as Grant had in the last year or so of the war, and yet they had failed to defeat the Confederates. Conversely, Grant did, and there is no doubting his significance to the annals of the American Civil War. His post-war record as president is less well regarded than it might be. As the 18th President of the United States, he guided the country through the arduous early period of Reconstruction and economic stabilization in the aftermath of the war. He was successful enough that he was easily re-elected for a second term in the election of 1872. Moreover, Grant succeeded in reducing the power of groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, in the aftermath of the war to a significant degree. Certainly, the Klan rose to become a very troubling aspect of American life again in future decades, but this was not Grant's fault. Furthermore, while his policies towards the Native Americans of the Plains ultimately ended in war in the mid-1870s, Grant's approach towards the Indians was relatively progressive for its time, and the Sioux War was as much the product of decades of Western expansionism as it was anything Grant did during his term in office. Finally, his role in resolving the crisis which ensued from the presidential election of 1876 needs to be considered and appreciated. Thus, we are left with a man who has been largely unfairly denigrated by subsequent generations. Grant was something of a contrarian, and certainly a heavy drinker throughout his life. But ultimately, he navigated many of the difficulties and challenges he encountered as well as he could. There are a great many of America's presidents who are generally more favorably regarded than Grant, who, if they had been placed in his shoes between 1869 and 1877, might not have kept the ship of state on such an even keel in the aftermath of the only civil war the country has ever experienced. That is to his credit. What do you think of Ulysses S. Grant? Should he be primarily remembered for his role as a general in the American Civil War? Or is his legacy as President of the United States one which has been unfairly dismissed and forgotten? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Hello guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel, please visit our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards, such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.